Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another live session with Body Integrity Fitness. Today, we are going to be exploring the knee and its function and examining the muscles that cross it and the tendons that are very important to the knee. And so I'm asking you guys to like and share, invite, join, take a part of this video. Hi, Richard. Thank you for joining. Invite somebody, share. We're going to get right into it. So last week I had panelists on discussing about the hip and some hip injuries. And we discussed prior to that, the week before, we examined the hip and its function. We learned that the hip is a ball and socket joint. It performs circumduction, meaning that it can bend and flex in all planes of movement. There is flexion and extension of the hip, external rotation in the hip joint, and we learned about the many muscle groups that cross the hip joint. But as I also mentioned, there are some some of those same muscle groups perform dual action in both the hip and the knee joint. This is why if you have issues with your knees, sometimes it impacts your joints, because not only are there muscles that cross both of those joints, there are also some very strong and powerful tendons that also insert in or along those same joints, and you'll find that it helps produce some of those joint actions that happen within the knee. So I just want to start off by going through the anatomy of the knee. So I have my partners here who are going to help me. My skeleton, he kind of fell off of his podium. So I'm just going to get him up and hold him in my hand today. So today we're looking at this tiny little bone here. I want to extend his knee, his femur bone, so that you can see that this little guy right here is the patella. This little bone is so small in our bodies, but it causes so many problems in our leg joints. And some of the movements we see here are flexion, extension. You have internal and external rotation. My little skeleton will allow me to show you the full internal and external rotation of the knee. Good afternoon, Renee. Thanks for joining. Like, share, join, invite. And so with that, if we remember, you have your quadricep group muscles that covers the femur, but it also, at the end of that muscle group, it inserts here on the patella. And then below here, you will have your patella tendon, and on the lateral aspect or the outside, you have your iliotibial band that runs down the side of the femur on top of those muscles, and its origin here and inserts down here at the patella. And then there are some other ligaments that we're going to go over, but there's not a lot of bone associated with our little patella, only in that it is called the tibial femoral joint because the way that the patella is positioned, it kind of like hangs in between this groove. Yes, we are. I am going to cover that, Brene. And so if you can't wait till the end, the tips will be there because we're actually going to go over tendonitis of the knee when we get through the musculature and the tendons. And I am going to discuss that. So if you can't stay until the end or if you have to jump in later, I definitely am going to cover that aspect. So, we know that this little itty bitty bone here, helps support the entire body weight, and it helps with transmit forces from the femur down to the tibia and the fibula here, and it facilitates movement between the femur and the head of the tibia. Okay, so this is why it is known as a hinge joint, because if you can see here on the side, when we flex and extend here at the knee, that it hinges, which is totally different from the ball and socket circumduction movement of the hip. So we see the bones are facilitated for the movement that it creates within the body. So we can see how having a hinge type of movement would limit the hip if we had hinge movement only at the hip. We need to be able to move that hip in multiple planes of motion so that we can walk properly, right? And we discussed last week when the hip is injured, then we lose the ability for our range of motion in the hip. And sometimes we do only have that hinge type of movement in the hip due to deterioration here in the acetabulum, which is the hole that the head of the femur sits in, where we call it a ball and socket joint. And so if that is there's some impairment there, then we kind of have that hinge or limited movement, and that's where you will find stiffness in the hip. But here in the knee, we can see that we don't need to have that great of movement in the knee, because if the knee could move in a circumduction or able to move in all planes of motion freely like the hip, we would have a pretty unstable leg at this point, right? Because any way that we can stand, that knee would give out on us because it would not be stable. So it's kind of awesome the way God designed our bodies, knew what kind of hinge or what kind of joint we needed. And it's kind of like when an architect or a contractor is building a building or home, they know that certain hinges on doors that work on doors may not necessarily work in cabinets, that will not work in a drawer, or say let's work in the garage to open the garage door. So every part of the body has a special movement that is designed to facilitate that movement. So again, the knee has that hinge movement, so it allows for, again, a free movement between the femur and the head of the tibia here. And as I said, in life, I should say in vivo, in our bodies, this patella guy kind of hangs in the middle of that space, but it is supported by a lot of strong ligaments and muscles that we're going to get into in just a moment. So as I stated, it has a hinge joint property. They call it a double condyloid joint, but we know it as a modified hinge joint that allows hinge and pivot action. Why does it allow pivot action? Because if you're a basketball player or a tennis player, you need to be able to have that internal, external rotation ability or capability so that you can move and pivot back and forth in different planes of motions when you are in your stance, your ready stance, and really for all active sports, football, soccer, baseball, basketball, tennis, even track and field. We have to be able to stand and support and then get into that ready stance movement so that you're ready to move, ready to pivot, to move and go in a direction, to block, to defend, to tackle. If you're going to tackle, you know, the linemen and the defensive men, they're down in the crouch position and they need to be able to push off their hinge, and then they need to be able to push off and extend to generate power and force to drive forward when they are tackling, making their tackles. You know, if they're a baseball player or a soccer player, they're also in this ready bent knee position because this is the quickest way to pivot and run, to push off to go and try to steal a base. The catcher is ready so that when he or she receives that ball, they can immediately push off and go grab the ball, generate force. So that is what this knee does. This kneecap does. That is the motion and the action that's happening within this joint. This, they call it the tibial-femoral joint. So the tibial, this big bone here, femoral joint, which we talked about, tibial-femoral, because it sits, the kneecap, this little guy here, sits right here, but it has a great deal of responsibility. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, all right. So I'm going to use my lady today, my lady model today. And we're going to kind of look at it, but I don't know, I think the guy, his ligaments are a little thicker. You can kind of see them better, I think. Yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry. We're going to use my guy. I feel kind of biased. We're going to use the guy. So we're going to kind of go over some of the muscles that help with knee flexion and knee extension. So we're going to actually cover some of the same muscle groups that we covered on last week with the hip during hip flexion and extension, because again, these muscles cross two joints. They cross the hip joint and they cross the knee joint. Okay, so with knee flexion, we have our quadriceps group here. Okay, and so in flexion, the bicep femoris helps flex it. And then on the back, I'm sorry, I went backwards. We have the bicep femoris here in the hamstrings. And it helps with flexion and extension, flexion of the knee. So you have the semitendinosus and the semimembranosus that helps. We have our gracilis that comes, I thought I had this down pat, guys. Here we go again. Gracilis that comes down here. Okay, you have your sartorius muscle that starts here and comes across. That's this guy here. Okay, you have your gastrocnemius, which is your calf muscle as a whole. You have your, and if we would peel this full calf muscle down, you have your popliteus and your plantaris, which make up the whole calf muscle. Dealing with knee extension, you have your rectus femoris, which is the quadricep right here, that main muscle. And as you can see it inserts here at the hip and down here inserts right on the top of the knee. And keep that in mind, okay? Then you have your Vastus lateralis, which is the outside muscle here of your quad. Okay. And then you have your vastus medialis, which is this muscle here of the quad. Okay. And your vastus intermedius, which is a muscle that is under the rectus femoris. Okay, it's right in here. But we would have to cut this muscle away for you to see it. So it's a deep muscle. Okay, so we have your quadriceps basically and your hamstrings, which assist in knee flexion, bending, and extending here. And it also helps with hip extension and flexion, whether you are bending the knee or whether you're walking ambulation. We talked about that on last week. So again, we have some of those same muscle groups that are covering two joints. And that is very important because you will find that you have a lot of injuries and things of that nature, or tendonitis, or issues that you have with your knee, or something starts in your hip and then you start having problems with your knee, which we heard about from my mom with her issue with her hips. She started having some compensatory injuries in her knee because some of those same muscles that were designed to help flex and extend both the hip and the knee, they were actually kind of confused because the hip was damaged, so it did not have full range of motion. And then it was compounded that it was not able to fully flex and extend the hip, which means that it also inhibited the ability to flex and extend on the knee joint. So that's why you find that some of these injuries, whether it starts in the knee and goes up to the hip, that it becomes kind of compensatory whichever way it starts, that you find that, man, now my knee is hurting and it started in my hip. But that is because a lot of these same muscle groups that cross both of those joints, and so they kind of pull and tug on each other. And that's why if one is misaligned or not firing properly, or the joints are malaligned, that it starts to pull and misalign and cause malalignment within those other joints. We are a full functioning kinetic chain, people. And that's what we have to understand about our bodies, is that we are so very, very interconnected that it's very crazy, right? So when I talk about the knee, we have some very, very powerful ligaments that are responsible for carrying out some of these major actions in our knee. I'm going to start with one of the ones that we are most familiar about. We hear about it with athletes in every field, from soccer to sometimes in dance, right, and cheerleading, right, and that's the ACL. It's the anterior cruciate ligament, right, and so that ligament, I'm going to see if you can, they didn't do such a good job of showing the ligaments here. But these ligaments that I'm going to be discussing, let me see if I can get up really close. They lie, so remember this is the patella here, right? And then this is the insertion of the quadriceps tendon here above on the patella, and then this is the patella tendon below, right? So those are the two ligaments that kind of keep this knee taut, right, in this direction. But these other ligaments that are very powerful and have a great deal of influence, they attach underneath or behind the knee. I'm going to kind of show you on my skeleton so you can know what I mean. So these ligaments attach up under here to hold the knee in place. And they're very, very strong ligaments, right? And so they help keep this knee in its place so that it moves. So the knee is supposed to track back and forth. That's what these tendons help it track forward and back over the tibial femoral joint, back and forth. That allows it to give, again, allows you to have that hinge movement. So the way my skeleton is positioned, the patella has tracked up the way it's supposed to with the assistance of those ligaments and the muscles attached to those ligaments. So if we could see the patella tendon, which would be here attached, it would be stretched out, and it would be taut, but the quadriceps tendon would be kind of loose, because of the hip flexion and the knee flexion that's occurring, right? And then when there's extension of both the hip and the knee, then this tendon, the quadriceps tendon, will become taut, and the patella tendon will be a little lax. Now, when I'm saying lax, I don't mean that it's just like kind of like a stretched out rubber band. It just means that the tension has been released the way it is supposed to be released in a relaxed state for that tendon, right? And part of the other injuries that occur is that over time, some of these tendons, they become stretched out, they become weak, and they become weak because they are also associated with the muscles that are associated with these tendons. And so when they get weak and stretched out, that's when you have a patella or knee that is not stable. And then your knee starts tracking over here when you bend, or over here when you bend, instead of front and forward and back, straight up and straight down. It tracks left, it tracks right, and then that causes pain. It causes inflammation in the ligaments, and we're getting to those juicy bits now. So then you have your coronary ligaments, you have your MCL, or your medial collateral ligament, then you have your lateral ligament. So your ligaments. So what's happening is that you have you have a branch of ligaments that are. Let me get my guy up here in this space. I'm covering it so you can't see. In this space, there are a bunch of ligaments that are holding this guy also in place, along with those few muscle groups. You have, I spoke about your patella ligament. You have your posterior cruciate ligament, and you have your posterior oblique ligament, and you have your transverse ligament. All these ligaments play a function in how that the knee is moving and being supported. Some of them prevent certain movements in your knee, right? So, sometimes you kind of move funny and your leg kind of stalls, and that is those ligaments in place that are preventing that movement, because that is not a natural movement for your knee to have. And so the body's natural reaction is to kind of stop you. And that is also how injuries occur, because when we have too much compounding force within those ligaments, because they are ligaments, right? And we have to remember that ligaments are not muscles. They are very, very thick connective tissue, and they don't have a lot of vascularity, meaning there's not a lot blood flow going to them. I'm trying to think of a good way to help you understand fully what a ligament is. It's a connective tissue, and it's kind of more like just a lot of tape holding an arm in place. And so it's not really necessarily, the tape doesn't have a lot of veins running to it. It's just a very thick connective tissue formed to keep that thing in place, right? And so some of the issues that, that we tend to see with the knee are the patellotendinopathy, or what we call jumper's knee. Okay, and a lot of these, some of these injuries are overuse injuries, right? You have your iliotibial band syndrome or your IT band syndrome. They call that the runner's knee. You have your patellofemoral syndrome, which is the poor patella tracking that I spoke to you about. And then you have the most common, as I spoke about earlier, is your ACL and those tears. Now, because there are muscles attached to this connective tissue, these ligaments that hold this knee in place, it is very important that your muscles are strong enough to support the tension and help maintain the tension within these ligaments. And so when those ligaments or those muscles atrophy and they become lax, it makes that joint become unstable. And so that's why, as strong as that joint is, it can also be equally weak. And that is why it is important that you train your muscles to fire properly so that you can build or cause hypertrophy in the proper muscles, and that they know how to fire properly, when it's time to extend, or when it's time to flex, or when it's time to stop. Those muscles know exactly, they innervate, or those motor units, they fire the right group of muscles at the right time. And so when there's weakness in the muscles, whether it's neurological, the motor units are not firing properly, or just atrophy within that muscle is weak because there's improper form. That's mainly the major cause, is that when you're building the muscle, you are not using proper form, and you are not engaging the proper motor units to fire to perform that exercise that is specific to that muscle group. Then you develop weaknesses within that muscle group, which cause weaknesses around those tendons, and that those tendons being able to be held taut by those muscle groups so that that knee joint remains stable. So that's why when I see a lot of injuries, especially with ACL, I am concerned about the foundational training and conditioning of the athlete. And it's irregardless, that's a bad word. It's regardless of whatever sport you're in, from cheerleading down to the very high contact sports of football, basketball. One of the main reasons that we see a lot of ACL tears in females, it's a little bit more prevalent in women, is because women are not trained properly when they're lifting weights. They don't have a good weight training regiment. They are not trained how to land. They're not trained how to jump. They're not trained properly how to innervate the right muscle groups when they're pivoting and causing internal and external rotation at that knee joint, so that the muscle group and that tendon is strong enough to support that weight and support that action at the same time. And so that's why you see a lot of re-injuries, because even after the athlete has had surgery, in most cases, to repair it, that rehab, they don't go through the full rehab, or mentally they don't trust the knee anymore and its ability to remain stable, or any stability of the knee at all. And one prime example that we all know and have watched, and that was I just lost this kid's name. The boy who played for the Bulls. Anybody? What is this kid's name? Oh, I can't think of his name right now. It'll come to me. But when he got injured initially with his knee, he first of all, in my opinion, when I was watching him play, he came back too soon from rehab. Knees are unstable joint because, as I said, they're modified hinge joint, meaning that there is some ability to pivot. So it's not just kind of open and close what hinges do. There is some ability to move in other planes of direction. And so when he came back, I believe that he came back too soon. As I was watching him play, he was just he wasn't confident in the movement of his knee and or it being a stable joint. I cannot think of this kid's name for nothing in the world right now. If anybody knows it, what's the boy that got injured with the Bulls? Can you type his name? I can't think of his name. But so that lets me know that maybe he should have stayed out a little bit longer, doing some rehab, doing some more strengthening in the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, the calf muscles, because again, as I showed you, all of those muscles cross the knee, and they also are attached to the tendons that kind of make a bridge to support the knee to ensure that it's moving and tracking in the proper location, and which is front and back in relation to the femur and tendon. Your knee should not be tracking, your kneecap should not be tracking right and left. It should be forward and back, right? With the ability to internally or externally rotate through pivoting, right? And so I felt like, he came back too soon and that he needed to take some more time with rehab. But we also live in a world that's kind of microwave, and so everybody's like, oh, the surgeries are more advanced, and the healing process is less. And this is what I have to say about knees. Knees and shoulders are tricky. Knees, shoulders, and hips are tricky, but especially knees. And it really depends on the person who this injury has occurred with, and it depends on how their body is healing and how they are aggressively going at rehab. You want to be like right in the pocket when it comes to rehab, meaning you don't want to be too lax and too afraid to rehab the knee, but you don't want to be too aggressive because you really want to get back on the field and you re-injure the knee. I take great issue when I see kids in 8th grade and high school with this type of injury, because it lets me know again that foundational training is not there. Talent will only get your foot in the door. You have to train. And I wish that some of the coaches, that they still had that mindset that an athlete who is highly talented, that training only gets them that foot in the door. I mean, that talent only gets that foot in the door, but they have to train to continue to make gains and to get to the next level. So let's talk about some of the injuries that a little bit more. So the patella tendonitis, the jumper's knee. Okay, so what happens there, so I'm going to use my guy here, is that here the ligament, the patella ligament and the knee gets inflamed. The meniscus, or I like to think of the meniscus and burses as little joint pillows here, so that there isn't any bone on bone between the femur and the tibia, that they are also acting as cushions to help build this bridge of support in this joint. And so how do they get overflamed joint or inflamed? From overuse. It's an overuse injury. That's why balance is very important when you're exercising, and that you have to learn to listen to your body. If you are, I'll say this. Even the most elite athletes, they have rest days. They cycle so many days and then they have rest time, because even they understand that the body has to recover. When you are taking your body to the next level in training, you're in a sense breaking it down to build it up, right? So you are doing more intense workouts, having more intense lifting bouts. Your sessions of working out, they're lasting longer, right? You have to build your body into it. And so when you don't allow your body to rest, some of these overwork or overuse injuries, they become chronic over time. So that speaks to your question about your tendonitis, Renee, that it has become chronic because at the time of the initial incident, so this probably happened years ago, right? Maybe in high school or in college when you were in some type of activity, whether it was dance or a sport, there was a time in which your knee started giving you some issues, and you didn't give it enough time to heal completely. And with that, then now it has become a chronic reoccurring condition, even when you're not active in that sport anymore, or that particular activity. It becomes chronic over time because you still, we forget that we still have to use our bodies daily outside of our physical activities. So when we're using our bodies daily, we're still using those same muscles, right? Because we have to walk, we have to sit down, we have to stand up, we climb stairs, and so we are using those same muscle groups and tendons, right? And so even though you may sit down, you may have stopped doing that particular activity which caused it, you're still agitating it with your everyday function and living. And this is how, when people get injuries, their quality of life is decreased because they just didn't take the sufficient time to sit down and heal. So what about the iliotibial band? So that is the thick band, again, that runs down the side from the hip and inserts right here at the knee, right? So what happens is that this tendon gets extremely tight. Like sometimes if you can just, I know some of you have known me and you saying your knee hurt, and the first thing I ask you to do is come here and I'm rubbing or pushing on the side of your leg, because this tendon gets extremely tight from that repetitive, like especially if you're running. That's why they call it a runner's knee, because you're running, so you have hip flexion, knee flexion, and extension happen all the time when you're running, right? And this thing here is trying to keep these two joints, this tendon, the IT band, is keeping these joints in place, right? Because remember, this joint moves all around. It has circumduction, and you don't want your joint to be flapping like this when you're running, right? So it's helping keep this joint in place to only do hip flexion, knee flexion, and extension, right? Hip and knee flexion and hip and knee extension, right? When you're running, right? Or even when you're walking, okay? And so it's designed to keep this in place. And so it's very taut to begin with. It's a very, very thick, thick tendon. And it's very, very taut or tight anyway to begin with. And so in recent years, we didn't necessarily know how to fix it. We just stopped, just stretching out the muscle groups, which that helps. But you can release this tendon through myofascial release. So that's rolling over that foam roller. And I am not going to pull any punches with you, and I'm not going to sprinkle any sugar over it for you. It hurts when you do myofascial release on it. And that is just, you're going to lay on your side and you're going to have that. I'm going to use my pen as a foam roller, and you're going to roll up and down the foam roller like this. It is going to be painful initially. Trust me, it's going to be painful. But the reward is going to be so refreshing when you get up. If you are a runner, you're running miles, you should roll out at least daily, at least, if you're running 4 times a week, 3 of those times you should also be rolling out. It's real talk. Because when it's super tight, it pulls both at the hip and especially at the knee. So what you find is that it's pulling on the knee, and so it is causing improper patellar traction, right? Because this joint is here on the lateral or the outside part of your portion of your body, and so it begins to pull that knee that way because it's trying to get some type of relief so that you can perform the hip flexion and extension at the knee when you're running. So if you are an avid runner, and if you run, or if you're an athlete in general, you should be rolling your body out. Let me just say that. You should be rolling your body out. You should be rolling your body out anyway, because, we get tight, and if we don't stretch out properly and we don't keep our muscles at their proper resting length, we can develop adhesions, which we call knots or balls. And those adhesions are nothing but that muscle that has gotten a kink in it. It did not relax out to its full resting length. And so the way that we get rid of those adhesions, because if the adhesions are allowed to continue on, all they're going to do is cause injury within that muscle, which is going to cause injuries within the joint, and it's going to be a cascading effect, and it's going to be so on and so on, like the Willow Blossom commercial. So it's going to start one place and it's going to end somewhere else, and you're going to end up with some compensatory injuries as a result of it. So you really have to keep your body at a body homeostasis. That's my made up term. At the external homeostasis of making sure that your muscles are well stretched, that you have released any tension within those muscles, that you give your muscles the proper time to relax and recover. Because when you don't, when you push yourself to the ultimate extreme, you get ultimate extreme injuries. Side note, one of the reasons why I have not been a great fan of CrossFit is because they do push extremities. And what I like to watch the CrossFit games, but one thing I'll tell you is that you see a lot of injured athletes competing because they are pushing their bodies to the limit and beyond. And nothing's wrong with that. Don't get me wrong, okay? Nothing's wrong with pushing your body past its limits. You can do amazing things, right? I am not against that. But what I do know about CrossFit athletes, some of those athletes who are really at the elite professional level, who are winning the CrossFit Games year after year, most of them did not start participating for at least 2 years after they've been training. So that's just something to chew on. I think that if you are a sedentary person you need to build into CrossFit. You should not get off the couch and go join CrossFit, because if you remember, they were known for injuries, for high level injuries, and they were known for rhabdomyolysis. And what people don't understand is that rhabdomyolysis is dangerous, and it can be deadly. Okay, it is the breakdown of all of your muscular tissue. It's just starting to dissolve, and you're basically kind of bleeding from within from your muscles. And if you have ever read any article or known anyone who's had rhabdomyolysis, you will know that they can never rebuild that muscular tissue once they take it to that level. It is going to always be squishy and flabby. So that's just food for thought. A lot of CrossFit people don't like to hear that, but it's the truth of the matter. I mean, I had a conversation with the CrossFit coach, and he was like, well, we didn't have any injuries this year. And that was like, he was so proud of that. And I was just standing there like shaking my head like, are you serious? Because I hate injuries, because I think that they're unnecessary. Now, do things happen? Absolutely, they do. I am not oblivious to that, but if we train properly and if we teach and instruct our clients properly, we reduce the rate of injury, and we reduce the exposure to the amount of injuries that our clients will ever see and ever face. And that is what Body Integrity Fitness is all about. We're about building a complete and healthier you, from the inside out, from the mind throughout the body, but also teaching you how to properly put together a workout, a quality workout, with proper form, because you'll hear me say, and you've heard me say in times past, form is everything. It is everything. And if you have not properly trained your neurological pathways, and when lifting weights and going through mechanics of how to lift and run and perform whatever the activity is, you will get injured. And there's no way around that. So that is why when your IT band is extremely tight, it pulls on both your hip and your knee, because it crosses both joints. And that is why you have extreme pain in your hip and in your knee. Also, sometimes with runners, your hip flexors, where's my little guy? Your hip flexors are tight. Those little guys behind here, they're tight. And so you haven't stretched them out. And while you're not stretching them out, they pull on your hip and your lower back, right? And so you start to see a cascading effect from the point of the injury or the discomfort. There is a cascading effect that happens, and so then you start to have pain other places. It's like, but it's starting in my knee and now it's in my hip, or it's starting in my hip and now it's in my knee, and now it went down to my ankle and I can barely bend my foot. Well, because that kinetic chain, it's all connected. When you dislodge one, you have dislodged them all. And that's just what happens. If you think about it in your own life, that is what happened. So, patellofemoral syndrome, again, that is the patella tracking. So, again, that comes to from a laxity in the ability of those ligaments and muscles to properly form the support of the knee joint, of the kneecap itself, to move properly over the tibiofemoral joint, which is the femur and the head of the tibia. It's where the knee is located. And so if those ligaments are not taut enough and strong, I got the best illustration of those. It just came to me. If you think about the electrical wires on one of those tall antennas, and you notice how it's the long pole, right? And then they have all these wires coming out in a triangle, and all of those poles are there. They're taut. and they're very tight, and they support that antenna like this so it stands nice and tall. That is what those ligaments form. That's the type of structure that they form around the knee, to keep that knee joint stable, right? And so when any one of those wires begin to get loose, the stability begins to decrease and decrease and decrease. And that's why you can, after time, if you haven't taken the necessary steps through rehab or strengthening up those muscles, groups around those tendons to pull them taut again, that you can tear your ACL from just walking up the stairs, which I've heard some people do, or from just getting out of the chair or just getting up off of the floor, or what we call your knee dislocates all of a sudden, from you just stand in one place and you went to pick it up and move it, and your knee came, we said dislocated. That is poor patellar tracking. That's the patellofemoral syndrome. So in all those cases, it is a matter of strengthening up the quadriceps and the hamstring and the calf or the gastrocnemius and those muscle groups around those tendons, because they, think about it. If you remember my illustration with those wires and that antenna. So if one wire snaps, then the stability of the antenna kind of decreases, right? It's going to sway a little bit more in the wind now because that one wire is tapped, which is why, the electric company, they're going to send someone right out to fix that wire, because the stability of those wires, the remaining wires to hold up that antenna, begins to decrease over time, and with wear and tear. Wear and tear being the weather, with the wind, heavy rain starting to deteriorate other structures on those wires, and so it deteriorates over time. And the same thing is happening in your knee when you allow your muscles to atrophy or lose their tone and things, lose their tone and lose their strength. They lose their ability to hold those ligaments stable and taut and keep the knee supported and stable. So with all of those, you have to rest. Rest is very, very important. Swimming is a good way to recover. When you're coming out of rehab, or if you just want to strengthen those muscles and ligaments, doing some balance exercises helps with increasing the stability in that joint, within that joint. Properly training the neuromuscular pathways and innervating the right motor groups or motor units to perform the exercise. So, for example, if you are doing exceeded leg extensions, right? Knee extensions. I shouldn't see your butt lifting up. You lift it, your butt is lifting up as you're lifting the weight. You've taken the focus off of the quadricep muscle group for their ability to lift that weight. Every muscle that you train, that is the muscle that should be focused on. That is the neurological pathway that should be built, so that when it's time to do that leg extension, that the only muscles that are focusing are those quadricep muscles and the hamstrings, because they're helping. The hamstrings are helping during the eccentric phase of lowering the leg, right? And so when we're not properly training our muscle groups, that's why, traditionally you find that a lot of athletes, we have a leg day and we had an upper body day, because it was important to make sure that we train antagonists together, so that in certain exercises, because, for example, with a squat, When you do a squat, it is the same muscle groups that are taking you into the squat and the same muscle groups that are sending you up. Why do you say that? You have your quadriceps, you have your hamstrings, and you have your glute muscles. I guess I'll show you on here on my other guy. Quads, hammies, and glute muscles, right? These guys are, remember, hip flexion and extension. So I can't move, I can't bend him. Hip flexion in the squat, hip extension. Agonist here, antagonist here. Quad agonist, hammies antagonist, right? That just means the opposite. They're doing, while these are contracting, these are relaxing. While these are relaxing, these are contracting to pull you back to your neutral position, right? And so while this action is occurring, we need to be training them both. That's why you should have controlled movement and focus on the muscle groups that you're working so that your muscles have full control and full gauge of what they're doing and the action that they're creating. I'm going to stay on about 5 more minutes. So for initial injuries such as tendonitis, the first thing that we want to do is rest and ice. Eventually, and we want to slowly get rid of the adhesions that have built up. And then eventually we want to relax them. So then we will go from alternating heating and icing to just heating. There's the TENS units that you see which stimulate muscle recovery and healing through the neuromuscular pathways of cellular regeneration from the electrical current that is coming from the stem machine. That's the kind of the basis of what the stem machine does. And so, you know, if it has become a chronic condition for you, one of the things that is happening in there is inflammation. So you may have to take some type of analgesic, or use an analgesic cream, which is a pain relieving cream, or a pain relieving pill that will help relieve pain and also decrease the swelling, because that's what inflammation is, it's swelling. And so what that does is it helps bring that muscle or that tendon back to its normal size and position, because when it's swollen, it's big and it's out of position, right? That's why you shouldn't exercise or continue to press yourself when you're injured. You should sit down and allow your body to heal, because a lot of times you just make it worse and it becomes a chronic condition. And we're going to talk about a chronic condition I suffer with, and that's plantar fasciitis. But what you're going to find when we get to that is that has to do with the way that my hips are set in my body, and that kinetic chain in itself, it makes me susceptible for certain injuries. I know it's crazy. Our body is so freaking amazing. It's like so amazing. That's why it's very important. And you know, exercise is a science. It's a beautiful science, and I love it. And everybody is not going to get into it on the level that I'm in on it. But you do need to know some basic important facts about your body and how you can get a dynamic workout devoid of injuries. And so so again, you have icing, and if it has become a chronic condition, the first thing you want to do is try to rest it. You can do an ice massage at that time, maybe not an ice pack, but an ice massage, because that ice massage, it allows you to take the inflammation out across the entire tissue that is inflamed at that time, and get it to relax. And then, you know, you can take also, like I said, anti-inflammatory, um, and that those things will help your body to recover. If you find yourself, you're an avid exerciser and you are experiencing some tendonitis, you need to move to no impact. So that means you need to get on the bike, you need to get on the elliptical, or you need to get in the swimming pool, or you just need to rest. It's okay to rest your body. And I understand that some of us have come from different journeys, and right now we're kind of on an extreme level, because before we were on the extreme no exercise tip, and now we are on the extreme exercise tip. And so it is important to find a balance, because you don't want injury to be the reason why you got back to the place that you got from, right? You don't want injury to be the cause of you being at a state of consistent exercise to now a state that you cannot exercise due to the injury, which causes other psychological issues. It causes depression. It just sets up a negative cycle on so many levels, and we'll get to those different topics as we go along. So I hope that you have learned something today. I hope that you've gotten some answers to some questions that you wanted to know about your knees. I hope that it was informative, and I hope, more importantly, that you join us on next week when I have panelists in who have suffered with various knee injuries, and we're going to talk about the emphasis of their injury and what they did to rehab. Derek Rose, that's the boy's name. It came to me right then. That's what I was talking about. But we're going to talk to them about their injuries and how they recovered, how it impacted their lives, whether they were an athlete or not an athlete. And so I hope that you would share this video with somebody and that you would encourage them to join our discussion on next Saturday at 3:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.